The courtroom was silent, so silent that you could hear the nervous breaths of the boy standing alone in front of the judge. His small hands trembled at his sides, his eyes fixed on the floor. Across from him, the prosecutor smirked. "So, let me get this straight." The prosecutor's voice echoed through the courtroom, thick with arrogance. He turned to the jury, shaking his head. "This boy, young, weak, and silent, expects us to believe his ridiculous story?" A few members of the audience chuckled under their breath. The boy swallowed hard, but he didn't speak. The prosecutor scoffed and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this is a waste of time. He's guilty. And quite frankly, I find it amusing that we're even pretending otherwise." He smirked at the boy again before stepping closer, his voice sharp like a knife. "Why don't you admit it? Say it. Say you did it." The boy clenched his fists, but still, he said nothing. The prosecutor's smirk widened. He turned to the jury, spreading his arms. "You see? Silence is a confession. If he were innocent, he'd defend himself." The judge suddenly leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. "Are you done?" His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something unreadable. The prosecutor lifted his chin. "I believe I've made my point." A slow smile stretched across the judge's face. "Good." He straightened and folded his hands together. "Now, let's play a game." The prosecutor frowned. "A game?" The judge nodded. "Yes. Let's pretend, just for a moment, that this boy is telling the truth." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor opened his mouth to protest, but the judge held up a hand. "No interruptions. Let's play this out." The tension in the air shifted. The arrogant prosecutor, once so confident, suddenly seemed unsure. And then, something happened. Something that made the prosecutor's face lose all color. The truth, the one thing he thought he had under control, was about to turn the quiet boy into a hero. It had all started 3 weeks earlier. It was just another normal morning in the city. Cars honked, birds chirped, and the air smelled like fresh coffee from the corner shop. In the middle of it all was Ethan Carter, a 14-year-old boy who kept his head down and minded his own business. He wasn't the kind of kid who caused trouble. In fact, most people hardly noticed him at all. Ethan lived with his grandfather, James Carter, in a tiny apartment on the edge of town. His grandfather wasn't rich, but he made sure Ethan always had what he needed. And even though their apartment was small and old, it was filled with warmth, love, and the smell of fresh bread every morning. Ethan's life was simple. Wake up, go to school, come home, help his grandfather, sleep, repeat. He didn't have many friends. Not because he didn't want any, but because he was different. While other kids played sports or video games, Ethan spent his time reading or helping his grandfather fix broken furniture to sell. That morning, Ethan walked to school as usual, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He passed the bakery, where the owner, Mrs. Thompson, always waved at him. "Good morning, Ethan." "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson." He smiled shyly and continued on his way. Everything seemed normal. But Ethan had no idea that by the end of the day, his entire world would change. At school, Ethan kept to himself as always. He listened to his teachers, did his work quietly, and stayed out of trouble. But trouble had a way of finding him anyway. At lunchtime, Ethan sat alone under a tree, eating the sandwich his grandfather had packed for him. He was halfway through his meal when he heard voices, loud, angry voices. "Hey, give it back." Ethan turned his head. Across the schoolyard, a group of boys had surrounded a smaller kid. The kid was Ben Peterson, a quiet 7th grader who had always been kind to Ethan. But right now, he looked scared. One of the boys, Tyler Jacobs, held something in his hands, a small, worn-out toy car. Ethan recognized it instantly. It was Ben's favorite toy, the one he carried everywhere. "I said give it back." Ben's voice wavered, but he stood his ground. Tyler smirked. "Why? What's a baby like you gonna do about it?" The other boys laughed. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He knew what would happen next. Ben would either fight and lose or walk away humiliated. Either way, it wasn't fair. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't the kind of kid who stood up to bullies. But something inside him stirred, a small but powerful voice. Do something. Before he could stop himself, Ethan stood up. His heart pounded as he walked toward the group. The closer he got, the louder his heartbeat became. Tyler noticed him first. He rolled his eyes. Oh, look, it's the quiet kid. What do you want? Ethan swallowed hard. Give it back. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. Tyler smirked. And if I don't? Ethan didn't have a plan. He just knew he couldn't walk away. Then I'll take it. The laughter stopped. The boys exchanged looks. Tyler stepped forward, standing chest to chest with Ethan. You think you can take it from me? Ethan didn't respond. He simply reached out and grabbed the toy car. For a second, Tyler was too surprised to react. Then, his face twisted in anger. You're gonna regret that. Before Ethan could move, a fist slammed into his stomach. The pain shot through him like fire. He doubled over, gasping for breath. Tyler grabbed his shirt and shoved him to the ground. You want to be a hero, huh? He pulled his arm back for another punch. Hey! A loud voice cut through the air. Everyone froze. A teacher was storming across the yard, her eyes blazing with fury. The bullies scattered, vanishing like smoke. Ben rushed forward, helping Ethan sit up. Are you okay? Ethan nodded, even though his ribs ached. He looked down at his hand. The toy car was still there. He handed it back to Ben with a small smile. Here. Ben's eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you. But Ethan didn't get to say anything else. Ethan Carter. He looked up to see the teacher glaring down at him. In my office. Now. Ethan's heart sank. But before he could say a word, Tyler, smirking from a distance, spoke up. He started it. Miss Miller. He tried to fight me. Miss Miller turned back to Ethan, her eyes sharp. Is that true? Ethan opened his mouth to explain, but no words came out. Tyler grinned. See? He's got nothing to say. Miss Miller crossed her arms. You're in big trouble, young man. Ethan's stomach twisted into knots. This was only the beginning, because in just a few days, he wouldn't just be in trouble. He'd be on trial. Ethan sat in the principal's office, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence in the room was deafening. Across from him, Principal Harris, a tall man with sharp eyes and a permanent frown, shuffled through some papers on his desk. Miss Miller stood beside him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Ethan swallowed hard. He had never been in trouble before. He had never even spoken to the principal, except for a polite good morning in the hallway. But now, here he was, sitting in front of him, accused of something he didn't do. Principal Harris finally looked up. Ethan, do you know why you're here? Ethan nodded but didn't speak. He had learned long ago that arguing never helped. People believed what they wanted to believe. Miss Miller sighed. Tyler and his friends said you attacked him. Ethan's fingers curled into fists in his lap. That was a lie. A complete lie. But how could he prove it? Principal Harris leaned forward. Ethan, we have a strict zero-tolerance policy for violence. If you were fighting... I wasn't, Ethan said quickly. His voice was small but firm. Principal Harris raised an eyebrow. Then what were you doing? Ethan hesitated. Ben's toy. They took it. I just wanted to give it back. Miss Miller sighed again, shaking her head. Ethan, I understand you were trying to help, but violence is never the answer. Ethan clenched his jaw. He wanted to shout that he hadn't been the one throwing punches. He wanted to tell them that Tyler had hit him, that he was the one on the ground. But what was the point? Tyler's father was on the school board. People like him never got in trouble. Principal Harris tapped his fingers against the desk. Because this is your first offense, I won't suspend you. Ethan felt a small wave of relief, until the principal's next words made his stomach drop. But we do have to report this. Ethan's breath caught. Report it? Principal Harris nodded. The school has policies about fights. We have to report all incidents of violence to the authorities. It'll go on your record. Ethan's mouth went dry. But I didn't. The principal raised a hand. That's my decision, Ethan. You can go now. Ethan stood, his legs shaky beneath him. As he turned to leave, he caught a glimpse of Tyler outside the office, smirking. A sick feeling settled in Ethan's stomach. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When Ethan got home that evening, he could already tell something was wrong. His grandfather, James Carter, stood by the kitchen table, an open letter in his hand. His usual warm smile was gone. "Ethan," his grandfather said softly, "come here." Ethan hesitated before stepping closer. His grandfather placed the letter on the table. It had the school's logo at the top. Ethan's heart sank. They had already sent a letter home. His grandfather didn't say anything for a long moment. Finally, he sighed and sat down. "What happened?" Ethan took a deep breath. "It wasn't my fault." His grandfather nodded slowly. "Tell me everything." And so Ethan did. He told his grandfather about the bullying, about how Tyler had taken Ben's toy, about how he had only wanted to help. He told him about the principal's office, about how no one believed him. When he finished, his grandfather was silent. Then, slowly, he reached out and took Ethan's hand. "I believe you," he said. Ethan blinked. "You do?" His grandfather smiled, the warmth returning to his eyes. "Of course. You've never been a liar." A lump formed in Ethan's throat. "But Ethan," his grandfather's voice turned serious, "the world isn't always fair. Sometimes, people believe the wrong things. Sometimes, bad people get away with things they shouldn't." Ethan lowered his eyes. "Then what's the point of doing the right thing?" His grandfather squeezed his hand. "Because the right thing is always worth doing, no matter what." Ethan nodded, but deep down, doubt still gnawed at him. The next morning, Ethan woke up to loud knocking on the door. He sat up quickly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. His grandfather, already dressed, hurried to answer it. The moment the door opened, Ethan's heart dropped. Two police officers stood outside. "James Carter," one of them asked. Ethan's grandfather nodded. "That's me." The officer pulled out a notepad. "We're here about Ethan Carter." Ethan's stomach twisted into knots. His grandfather stepped slightly in front of him. "What's this about?" The officer cleared his throat. "We received a report of an altercation at Ethan's school." His grandfather's face tightened. "Yes, and I assume you also received a report that my grandson didn't start that fight." The officers exchanged a glance. "Sir, we're just following procedure." Ethan felt his blood run cold. This was really happening. The other officer looked at him. "Ethan, we need you to come with us." Ethan's breath caught. What? His grandfather's voice turned sharp. "Wait just a minute. He's a child. He didn't commit a crime." The officer sighed. "That's not our decision to make, sir. We were given a report, and the school board is pressing charges for violent behavior." Ethan's vision blurred. Pressing charges? For defending Ben? His grandfather took a step forward. "I won't allow this." The officers hesitated. The first one spoke again, his tone softer. "Mr. Carter, I understand, but we don't have a choice. We need to take Ethan in for questioning." Ethan felt frozen in place. His legs refused to move. His grandfather placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "I'll be right behind you, Ethan. You're not alone." Ethan swallowed hard and nodded. He took a deep breath, then stepped forward. And just like that, Ethan Carter was taken away in the back of a police car, accused of a crime he didn't commit. Ethan sat in the cold, gray interrogation room. He had never been in a place like this before. The walls felt too close. The air smelled like old coffee and paperwork. A metal table sat between him and the officer across from him. Ethan's grandfather was in the waiting area, arguing with someone about getting a lawyer. But Ethan wasn't listening. His hands were folded in his lap, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The officer across from him, a man with tired eyes, leaned forward. "Ethan, you need to tell us the truth." Ethan looked down. "I already did." The officer sighed. "Son, you were seen fighting. The school board says you're a danger to the students." Ethan clenched his jaw. "That's not true." The officer studied him for a long moment. Then, he stood and left the room without another word. Ethan sat there, alone, his chest tight with fear. Then, the door opened again. This time, a man in a suit walked in. His expression was cold, calculating. "Ethan Carter," he said smoothly, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "My name is Jonathan Reeves. I'm the prosecutor on your case." Ethan's stomach dropped. Reeves smirked. I hope you're ready, kid. Because I don't lose. Ethan felt his whole world tilt. And just like that, things went from bad to worse. Ethan sat frozen in his chair, his fingers clenched into tight fists under the metal table. The prosecutor, Jonathan Reeves, leaned back in his chair, watching him with a smirk. His suit was perfectly pressed, his hair slicked back, and his eyes held no warmth, only amusement. You're awfully quiet, Reeves said, tapping a pen against his notepad. That's not a good sign, kid. Ethan swallowed hard. I didn't do anything wrong. Reeves chuckled. Is that so? He flipped through a file, pretending to skim the pages. Because according to the school board, you're a violent delinquent. You attacked another student, unprovoked. You were seen on the ground, throwing punches. Ethan's stomach twisted. That's not what happened. Reeves raised an eyebrow. So, you're calling your teachers liars? Ethan opened his mouth to answer, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't calling them liars, but they were wrong. He had only been trying to help. The prosecutor smirked. That silence? That's what guilt sounds like. He leaned forward. Let me explain how this works, Ethan. I don't care if you're a kid. I don't care if you were trying to play hero. The law is the law, and right now, the law sees you as a problem. And my job? My job is to make sure problems like you don't get the chance to cause trouble again. Ethan's breath caught. He wasn't a troublemaker. He had never been in a fight before. But none of that mattered to Reeves. The prosecutor stood up, smoothing out his suit. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to confess. You're going to say you started the fight, and we'll make this whole thing easy on you. Ethan gritted his teeth. I won't lie. Reeves' smirk faltered for a second before he forced it back into place. Suit yourself. He gathered his papers and turned toward the door. Before stepping out, he glanced over his shoulder. You just made the biggest mistake of your life, kid. The door slammed shut behind him. Ethan let out a shaky breath. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. His head spun. Was this really happening? Ethan's grandfather, James Carter, paced in the waiting room, his jaw tight with frustration. The officer at the front desk had already refused to let him see Ethan, and now, to make matters worse, he had just received another blow. They're pressing formal charges, he repeated, his voice dangerously low. The officer at the desk nodded. Yes, sir. The prosecutor believes this case warrants further action. James clenched his fists. Against a 14-year-old boy? Over a schoolyard fight? The officer hesitated. There's more to it than that. Tyler Jacobs' father is one of the major donors to the school district. He's pushing for this to be taken seriously. James' blood ran cold. So that was it. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't about what was right. This was about power. He turned sharply. Where's the nearest public defender's office? The officer sighed. I'd recommend hiring a private lawyer. The public defenders are overworked and… James shook his head. I don't have money for a private lawyer. Just tell me where to go. The officer scribbled an address on a slip of paper and handed it over. Good luck, sir. James took the paper and rushed out the door. He would not let them do this to Ethan. Ethan was placed in a holding room after the interrogation. It wasn't a cell, but it might as well have been. The walls were bare, the air cold, the silence deafening. He wrapped his arms around himself, trying to stay calm. This wasn't fair. He had only tried to do the right thing. The door creaked open, and a police officer stepped inside. Your grandfather is trying to get you a lawyer. Until then, you'll need to wait here. Ethan nodded numbly. The officer hesitated. For what it's worth, kid, I don't think you belong here. Ethan blinked in surprise. Then why am I here? The officer sighed. Because the people in power want you to be… Ethan's throat tightened. No one was coming to save him. He had to save himself. A few hours later, Ethan was escorted into the courtroom for his preliminary hearing. He barely had time to breathe before he was shoved in front of the judge. The courtroom was large, filled with strangers whispering among themselves. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Ethan spotted his grandfather sitting in the front row, his hands clenched into fists. Next to him sat a lawyer Ethan had never seen before. A public defender, no doubt. The man looked exhausted, flipping through files as if he had only just received them. At the other table stood Jonathan Reeves, the arrogant prosecutor who had questioned him earlier. He looked calm, confident. The judge, an older man with sharp eyes, tapped his gavel. "We are here today for the preliminary hearing of Ethan Carter." Ethan swallowed hard. Reeves stood up smoothly. "Your Honor, the state is prepared to proceed. The evidence against the defendant is clear. We request that he be tried as an adult." The courtroom gasped. Ethan felt his knees go weak. His grandfather stood abruptly. "That's ridiculous." The judge raised a hand. "Order in the court." He turned to Reeves, frowning. "He is 14, Mr. Reeves." Reeves smiled. "Yes, Your Honor. But we believe his actions show a clear intent to cause harm. He engaged in violent behavior and has refused to take responsibility. If he isn't held accountable now, who's to say what he'll do in the future?" Ethan's hands trembled. This couldn't be happening. The judge rubbed his temples. "Mr. Reeves, I will take your request under consideration. However, before I make any decisions, I would like to hear from the defendant." Ethan's mouth went dry as all eyes turned to him. The judge's gaze softened just a little. "Ethan Carter, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Ethan took a deep breath. This was his chance. His only chance. He lifted his head and met the judge's eyes. "I didn't start that fight. I was trying to stop it." Reeves scoffed. "So, you expect us to believe you're some kind of hero?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "I don't care what you believe. It's the truth." Reeves smirked. "The truth? The truth is that you're a violent kid who—" "Enough," the judge interrupted. He leaned forward. "I want to hear his side of the story." Without interruptions, Ethan took another breath. His heart was racing, but he refused to back down. "This is what really happened," he said. The room fell silent. And then, he told them everything. The courtroom was silent. Ethan could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him as he stood there, his hands clenched at his sides. He had never spoken in front of so many people before. His voice felt small, but he knew this was his only chance. He took a deep breath. "I was sitting under a tree at lunch when I saw Tyler Jacobs and his friends picking on Ben Peterson." His voice was steady, though his chest felt tight. "Tyler had taken Ben's toy, and I knew he wasn't going to give it back. Ben asked for it, but Tyler just laughed at him. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing." Jonathan Reeves, the prosecutor, sighed dramatically and shook his head. "So, you took it upon yourself to intervene? To play the hero?" Ethan ignored the sarcasm and kept his eyes on the judge. "I walked over and asked Tyler to give the toy back. When he refused, I reached for it. That's when he hit me." Reeves scoffed. "So, you're claiming self-defense?" "I didn't even fight back," Ethan said firmly. "I was on the ground the whole time. Tyler was the one throwing punches." Reeves smirked. "Do you have any proof of that? Because right now, we have multiple witnesses who say otherwise." Ethan's stomach dropped. He knew exactly what Reeves meant. Tyler's friends must have lied. They had seen everything, but they weren't going to tell the truth. The judge frowned, tapping his gavel lightly. "Mr. Reeves, let the boy finish." Ethan looked down at his hands. His knuckles were bruised from falling onto the pavement. "I didn't fight him. I was just trying to help Ben." The judge studied him carefully. "Did anyone else see what happened?" Ethan hesitated. He thought about Ben, about how scared he had looked when the bullies had surrounded him. Ben had seen everything. But would he speak up? Before he could say anything, Reeves shook his head. "Your Honor, the school's official report states that Ethan was the aggressor. We have multiple students confirming this. If we're going to start taking the word of a delinquent over that of multiple eyewitnesses, we might as well throw the entire justice system out the window." Ethan clenched his fists. A delinquent? Was that really what they thought of him? His grandfather stood up abruptly. "Your Honor, this is absurd. Ethan has never been in trouble a day in his life." The judge sighed and raised his hand. "Mr. Carter, please sit down." Ethan's grandfather hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into his seat, his face red with frustration. The judge turned back to Ethan. "Do you have anything else to say?" Ethan's mouth felt dry. If no one believed him, was there even a point? But then, he thought about what his grandfather had told him. The right thing is always worth doing, no matter what. Ethan lifted his head. I'm telling the truth. The judge sighed, rubbing his forehead. I need more than just your word, Ethan. At that moment, the doors to the courtroom swung open. Everyone turned. A small voice rang out. I saw what happened. Ethan's eyes widened. It was Ben Peterson. Ben, the shy seventh grader, stood at the entrance of the courtroom, looking nervous but determined. He clutched his toy car in his hands, the same one Ethan had saved. The judge straightened. Who are you? Ben cleared his throat. My name is Ben Peterson, and I was there that day. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reeves frowned. And what exactly do you think you're doing here, young man? Ben swallowed but didn't back down. Telling the truth. Ethan felt his heart hammering in his chest. This was his chance. The judge leaned forward. Come forward, Mr. Peterson. Ben walked up slowly, gripping his toy car so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stopped beside Ethan, then turned to face the courtroom. Reeves crossed his arms. And what, exactly, do you think you saw? Ben looked at Ethan, then at the judge. I saw everything. He took a shaky breath, then spoke louder. Ethan didn't start that fight. Tyler did. Gasps filled the courtroom. Ethan felt a wave of relief crash over him. Someone believed him. Reeves' smirk disappeared. That's quite a claim. Young man, do you have any proof? Ben nodded. I do. Reeves scoffed. Oh, really? And what would that be? Ben hesitated for a second, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, old-looking phone. I recorded it. The entire courtroom fell into stunned silence. Reeves' face turned pale. The judge's eyebrows shot up. Excuse me? Ben held out his phone with shaking hands. I was scared. When they surrounded me, I pulled out my phone and started recording. I didn't know what else to do. Reeves' jaw tightened. That's... The judge held up a hand. Silence. He turned to Ben. Are you saying you have a video of what happened? Ben nodded quickly. Yes, sir. The judge gestured to an officer. Bring me that phone. The officer walked over, took the phone, and handed it to the judge. The room held its breath as the judge pressed play. The silence in the courtroom stretched as the sounds of the schoolyard filled the air. Tyler's voice came first. Give it back, baby boy. Ben's own voice, scared but determined. No, it's mine. The sound of laughter. Then, Ethan's voice. Give it back, Tyler. Then, the scuffle. The sound of Tyler shoving Ethan. Then, the first punch. Gasps echoed through the room. The judge's expression darkened as the video continued. More punches. Ethan on the ground, not fighting back. The clear evidence of who the aggressor was. The video ended. Silence. Reeves looked like he had swallowed something sour. Ethan's grandfather let out a breath of relief, his hands shaking. The judge turned to Reeves. Mr. Reeves, would you like to explain why you were so adamant about charging this boy when the truth was so obviously in his favor? Reeves stiffened. Your Honor, I wasn't aware of this evidence. The judge's eyes narrowed. And yet, you were perfectly willing to prosecute this boy with no real proof. He shook his head. This case is over. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Was it really happening? The judge turned to him. Ethan Carter, you are free to go. Ethan felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. But then, the judge wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Reeves. As for you, Mr. Reeves, we need to have a discussion about the real injustice here. The prosecutor's face drained of all color. The entire courtroom leaned in, because whatever was about to happen next, it was going to be big. A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Everyone watched as the judge fixed his sharp gaze on Jonathan Reeves, the once smug prosecutor who now looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Mr. Reeves, the judge said, his voice carrying authority, this court does not take kindly to the abuse of power. You attempted to railroad a young boy with no real evidence, despite clear contradictions in the case. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Reeves cleared his throat and straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure. Your Honor, I was simply following the reports provided by the school. If this video had been made available earlier, The judge held up a hand. Enough. His voice was cold, firm. You were more than happy to humiliate this boy in open court, to paint him as a delinquent. If Ben Peterson hadn't stepped forward, Ethan Carter would have been punished for a crime he didn't commit. Reeves opened his mouth, but no words came out. The judge wasn't done. He turned to the school's legal representative sitting at the prosecutor's table. And as for the school board, I find it disturbing that you were so quick to accept the word of a privileged student like Tyler Jacobs while ignoring the possibility that Ethan was innocent. The representative, a middle-aged woman in a stiff gray suit, shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, the school was simply following protocol. Protocol? The judge scoffed. Your protocol nearly ruined an innocent boy's life. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Ethan's hands were still trembling. Was this really happening? Was someone actually standing up for him? The judge took a deep breath and exhaled. Then, he turned back to Ethan. His voice softened. Ethan Carter, on behalf of this court, I apologize. You should never have been put through this. Ethan nodded numbly. His throat was tight. Then, the judge's gaze darkened as he turned back to Reeves. Mr. Reeves, I will be filing a formal complaint against you for misconduct. And as for the school, I strongly recommend you reevaluate how you handle bullying cases. Because this was a disgrace. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Reeves' face turned red, but he didn't argue. He knew he had lost. Ethan glanced at his grandfather, who looked like he was trying not to cry. He reached over and squeezed Ethan's shoulder. It's over, his grandfather whispered. Ethan wanted to believe that, but something deep in his gut told him this wasn't over yet. Ethan stepped out of the courthouse, the cold air hitting his face. His grandfather walked beside him, a protective hand on his shoulder. Ben caught up with them, his toy car still clutched in his hands. Are you okay? He asked quietly. Ethan nodded. Thanks for what you did back there. Ben smiled shyly. You saved me first. It was only fair. Ethan's grandfather chuckled, resting a hand on Ben's shoulder. You're a brave young man, Ben. Ben grinned. I had to do something. It's like you always say, Mr. Carter. Doing the right thing is always worth it. Ethan's grandfather's eyes softened. That's right. For the first time in days, Ethan felt like he could breathe again. But that feeling didn't last long. Because as they stepped onto the sidewalk, a black car pulled up to the curb. The back window rolled down, and Ethan's stomach twisted when he saw Tyler Jacobs sitting inside. His father, Richard Jacobs, a powerful businessman and school board member, sat beside him. Richard Jacobs smiled, but it wasn't friendly. Well, looks like you got lucky, Carter. Ethan's grandfather stepped protectively in front of him. Is there something you need, Mr. Jacobs? Richard's smile didn't fade. Oh, I just wanted to see the boy who thinks he can embarrass my family and get away with it. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. I didn't do anything wrong. Richard's smile sharpened. That may be what the court says, but we both know how the world really works. Power wins, Ethan. And trust me, this isn't over. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Tyler leaned forward, his smirk as smug as ever. See you around, loser. The window rolled up, and the car sped away. Ethan's grandfather exhaled slowly. That man is dangerous. Ethan swallowed hard. I know. Ben's face was pale. What do we do now? Ethan's grandfather put a hand on his shoulder. We move forward. Together. Ethan nodded. But deep down, he knew. Richard Jacobs wasn't bluffing. Something was coming. And this time, it would be even worse. Ethan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Richard Jacobs' smug face, heard his chilling words. Power wins, Ethan. And trust me, this isn't over. Ethan had thought the worst was behind him, but now he knew better. Tyler's father was rich, powerful, and clearly willing to use that power to crush anyone who stood in his way. Ethan sat up in bed, staring out the window at the dark cityscape. His grandfather's soft snores echoed from the other room, a small comfort in the midst of his storming thoughts. What was Richard planning? Would he go after Ethan again? Or worse, would he go after Ben? A wave of dread settled in Ethan's stomach. He had to be ready. He just didn't know how. The next morning, Ethan walked into school, feeling the weight of 100 stares. The trial had been public news, and now, everyone knew what had happened. Some students whispered as he passed. That's the kid who almost got locked up. He says he's innocent, but who knows? I heard he got off because of some dumb loophole. Ethan clenched his fists and kept his head down. He was used to being ignored. But now, he wasn't just the quiet kid. He was the suspect. Ben walked beside him, shooting glares at anyone who talked too loudly. "Ignore them," he muttered. "They don't know anything." Ethan forced a small smile. "I'm trying." As they turned a corner, a voice stopped them. Well, look who's back." Ethan tensed. Tyler Jacobs. He was leaning against the lockers, arms crossed, a cruel grin on his face. His two usual sidekicks stood beside him, looking just as smug. Ethan exhaled sharply. "I don't have time for this, Tyler." Tyler chuckled. "Oh, but you had time to ruin my life, huh?" Ethan frowned. "You did that yourself." Tyler's smirk vanished. His eyes darkened, but before he could say anything, one of his sidekicks, Jason, snickered. "Your little court drama isn't over, Carter," Jason said. "Your buddy Ben saved you this time, but my dad says people like you always mess up again." Ethan's stomach twisted. Tyler leaned in, lowering his voice. "And when you do, no one's gonna save you." Ben stepped forward. "Leave him alone, Tyler." Tyler rolled his eyes. "Relax, nerd. I'm just giving him a warning." His smirk returned. "You think my dad's done with you, Carter? Think again." Ethan's fingers curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Then tell your dad I'm not afraid of him." Tyler's smirk faltered. For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes, doubt. Then he scoffed. "Whatever." He turned and walked away, his friends following close behind. Ethan let out a slow breath. Ben nudged him. "I can't tell if that was brave or really, really dumb." Ethan chuckled weakly. "Maybe both." But as they walked to class, the uneasy feeling in his gut didn't go away. Tyler was angry. His father was powerful, and sooner or later, they were going to strike. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched plate of food. His grandfather watched him carefully. "Talk to me, Ethan." Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "Tyler's not done with me. Neither is his dad." His grandfather exhaled. "I was afraid of that." Ethan met his gaze. "What do we do?" His grandfather leaned forward, voice calm but firm. "We prepare. We stay alert. And most importantly, we don't let fear win." Ethan swallowed. "But what if they do something worse this time?" His grandfather's expression hardened. "Then we fight back, with the truth. No matter what." Ethan nodded slowly, but deep down, he had a terrible feeling. This fight was far from over. And the next attack? It would be much, much worse. The attack came the very next day. Ethan and Ben had just arrived at school when they saw it. Spray painted across Ethan's locker in bold, red letters were the words, "Thief," "Liar," "Criminal." Gasps filled the hallway. Students whispered, pointing at Ethan as he stared at the words in shock. Ben's face turned red with anger. "Are you kidding me?" He turned to Ethan. "We have to tell a teacher." Ethan clenched his fists. His heart pounded in his ears. He already knew who had done it. Tyler. But proving it? That was another story. Before he could speak, loud footsteps echoed through the hallway. The principal, Mr. Harris, stormed toward them, his face like a thundercloud. "Ethan Carter," he barked. "In my office. Now." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What?" he stammered. "But I didn't." Mr. Harris folded his arms. "We received an anonymous tip that you were responsible for vandalizing school property." Ethan's heart nearly stopped. They were framing him. Ben stepped forward. "That's not true. Ethan would never." "That's enough, Mr. Peterson," Mr. Harris said firmly. "Ethan, come with me." Ethan looked around at the crowd. Some students whispered, shaking their heads. Others smirked, clearly enjoying the spectacle. And at the far end of the hallway, leaning casually against a locker, was Tyler, grinning. Ethan's chest tightened. This wasn't just a school prank. This was a setup. And if he didn't prove his innocence, they were going to destroy him. Ethan sat in Principal Harris's office, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. The principal paced back and forth, his face unreadable, flipping through a report. Ethan could barely focus. His mind was spinning. Someone had framed him. Not just anyone, Tyler. And now, if he didn't find a way to prove the truth, he would be labeled a criminal all over again. Mr. Harris finally stopped pacing and set the report down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "Ethan," he said, his voice measured, "this is a serious offense. Vandalizing school property is not something we take lightly." Ethan's throat was dry. "I didn't do it." Mr. Harris sighed. "An anonymous report was sent to my office, claiming that you were seen near the lockers before the incident." Ethan frowned. "Who reported it?" "That information is confidential," Mr. Harris said. "Of course it was." Ethan clenched his fists. "This isn't fair. I wouldn't do something like this." Mr. Harris studied him. For a moment, something softened in his expression. "I want to believe you," he admitted. "But the truth is, you already have a record." "A false record," Ethan shot back, anger rising in his chest. Mr. Harris exhaled, rubbing his temples. "The fact remains, Ethan, that your name is already tied to a violent case. And now this." Ethan's stomach twisted. This was exactly what Richard Jacobs had meant when he said, "When you mess up again, no one's going to save you." They had set this up perfectly, and Ethan had walked right into their trap. When Ethan left the office, he found Ben waiting for him outside. His best friend's face was red with frustration. "What happened?" Ben asked. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm suspended for 3 days while they investigate." Ben's jaw dropped. "But that's insane. You didn't do anything." Ethan nodded, exhaustion settling into his bones. "Doesn't matter. Tyler and his dad planned this. They knew exactly how to make it look like I was guilty." Ben clenched his fists. "We have to prove it was them." Ethan shook his head. "How?" Ben bit his lip. "The cameras." Ethan frowned. "What?" Ben's eyes lit up. "The school has security cameras in the hallways. If someone vandalized your locker, there's got to be footage of it." Ethan's chest tightened with hope. "You think we can get the footage?" Ben grinned. "Not us, but I know someone who can." 20 minutes later, Ethan and Ben sat in the back of the library, whispering with Milo Parker, one of the smartest kids in school. He was a tech genius, so much so that most teachers assumed he'd end up working for the government someday. Milo adjusted his thick glasses and leaned forward. "You're saying you need access to the school security footage?" Ethan nodded. "Can you help us?" Milo smirked. "Oh, I love a good hacking challenge." Ben paled. Wait. You're not actually going to hack the system, are you?" Milo rolled his eyes. "Relax, Mr. Morals. I don't need to hack anything." He tapped his temple. "I know how the system works. The security footage isn't stored online. It's on a private server in the principal's office. But there's another way to access it." Ethan and Ben leaned in. "How?" Ethan asked. Milo smirked. "The janitor's key card." Ben groaned. "Oh, this is sounding more illegal by the second." Milo shrugged. "Only if we get caught." Ethan swallowed. He knew this was risky, but if they didn't do something, his name would be ruined forever. He looked at Ben. "You don't have to be part of this." Ben crossed his arms. "Are you kidding? I'm definitely part of this." Ethan smiled. "Then let's do it." Later that night, the school was almost empty. Ethan, Ben, and Milo hid in the shadows near the janitor's office. Milo grinned as he peeked inside. "Perfect. The keycard is right there on his desk." Ethan's heart pounded. "How do we get it?" Milo held up a paperclip. "Leave that to me." Ben groaned. "I don't like this." Milo picked the lock in under 10 seconds, slipping inside like a ghost. He grabbed the keycard and hurried back out. "Boom," he whispered. "We're in." Ethan exhaled. "Let's go." They moved quickly through the halls, stopping in front of a locked security room. Milo swiped the keycard, and the door clicked open. Inside, a wall of screens flickered, showing footage from the school. Milo cracked his knuckles. "All right, let's find out who really did this." Ethan and Ben held their breath as Milo rewound the footage from the night before. And then, there it was. Tyler, spray painting Ethan's locker. Ben gasped. "We got him." Ethan felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived, because suddenly, a voice rang out behind them. What do you think you're doing? They spun around. Standing in the doorway was Principal Harris. Ethan's stomach dropped. They had just been caught breaking into the security room. And now? They were in even bigger trouble. Ethan's heart stopped. Principal Harris stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. The security room. The stolen keycard. The security footage playing on the screen. They were busted. Ben let out a nervous chuckle. Hey, Mr. Harris. Fancy seeing you here. Milo groaned under his breath. We're so dead. The principal stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Someone explain what's going on. Now. Ethan swallowed hard. We were looking for proof. Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. Proof of what? Ethan took a deep breath and pointed at the screen. That. The principal's gaze shifted to the footage. Tyler Jacobs. Spray painting Ethan's locker. Red letters spelling out, thief, liar, criminal. Ethan watched Mr. Harris closely. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He knew. Ethan clenched his fists. You suspended me for this. Everyone thought I did it. But the truth was right here all along. Ben stepped forward. Ethan was framed, sir. We had to prove it. Mr. Harris let out a long breath, rubbing his temples. I cannot believe this. He turned back to them. And you three decided the best way to handle this was to break into the security room? Milo coughed. Technically, I broke in. They were just my accomplices. Ben smacked him. Not helping, Milo. Mr. Harris sighed. This is serious. You stole a keycard. That alone could get you expelled. Ethan's stomach clenched. Expelled? No. He couldn't let that happen. Not when they had finally found the truth. He stepped forward. I know what we did was wrong, he admitted, his voice steady. But I had no choice. Everyone believed Tyler. No one even thought to check the cameras. Ben nodded. If we hadn't come in here, you never would have known the truth. Mr. Harris studied them for a long moment. Then, he exhaled. Stay here, he said finally. I need to make a call. Ethan's pulse quickened. Who are you calling? The principal's expression hardened. Tyler's father. Ethan and Ben exchanged glances. This was about to get ugly. 20 minutes later, Ethan sat stiffly in Mr. Harris's office, staring across the desk at Richard Jacobs. The man's face was unreadable, his expensive suit crisp, his posture relaxed. But his cold eyes told a different story. Next to him sat Tyler, who looked unusually pale. His confidence was gone. He slouched in his chair, eyes darting nervously. Ethan's grandfather sat beside him, his hands resting firmly on the desk, his gaze unwavering. Mr. Harris cleared his throat. Mr. Jacobs, I assume you've seen the footage. Richard smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. I have. Ethan clenched his jaw. So? What do you have to say now? Richard chuckled. Calm down, boy. No need to get emotional. Ethan's blood boiled. Emotional? This man had nearly ruined his life, and now he was acting like it was nothing? Richard turned to Mr. Harris. I assume you expect some kind of punishment? Mr. Harris nodded. Tyler committed vandalism and intentionally framed another student. That's a serious offense. Richard leaned back in his chair, sighing. Boys will be boys. Ethan's stomach twisted. Tyler shrank in his seat. He wasn't smirking anymore. He looked terrified. Ethan suddenly realized something. Tyler wasn't scared of getting caught. He was scared of his father. Mr. Harris's expression hardened. With all due respect, Mr. Jacobs, this is not just boys being boys. Your son framed Ethan for a crime. If we hadn't checked the footage, Ethan could have been expelled or even arrested. Richard waved a dismissive hand. That's dramatic. Ethan slammed his hands on the table. Dramatic? You tried to destroy my life. Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Then, his face went cold. Careful, boy. Ethan's grandfather finally spoke. His voice was calm, but deadly serious. No, Mr. Jacobs. You be careful. You think money and power give you the right to bully children? To ruin innocent lives? Richard turned to him, his smile sharpening. Ah, James Carter. The noble man with nothing. Ethan stiffened. Richard continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. I've worked hard for my success. My family is respected, and I won't let some nobody drag my name through the dirt. Ethan's grandfather didn't flinch. A respected man doesn't lie. A respected man doesn't frame a child. For the first time, Richard's smile disappeared completely. Silence filled the room. Then, Mr. Harris cleared his throat. Mr. Jacobs, your son is facing serious disciplinary action. I have no choice but to suspend him for 2 weeks. Tyler's head snapped up. What? Mr. Harris folded his hands. And I'll be making a full report to the school board. Richard let out a short laugh. You think the school board is going to punish my son? They answer to me. Ethan's grandfather didn't blink. Then we'll take it to the media. Richard's jaw clenched. Ethan's heart pounded. That was it. The one thing Richard Jacobs feared. Scandal. Public humiliation. Ethan could see the wheels turning in Richard's head. He could fight back, but the video evidence was damning. And if the truth got out, his precious reputation would shatter. After a long, tense moment, Richard let out a breath and smiled again. But this time, it was forced. Fine, he said smoothly. Tyler will serve his suspension. But don't think this is over. Ethan narrowed his eyes. What does that mean? Richard stood up and adjusted his suit. It means power wins in the end. And you? You have none. Ethan clenched his fists, but his grandfather placed a calming hand on his shoulder. Richard turned to his son. Let's go, Tyler. Tyler hesitated, glancing at Ethan. His expression was unreadable, but for the first time, he didn't look smug. He looked ashamed. Ethan held his gaze. You don't have to be like him. Tyler flinched. Richard grabbed his arm. Come now. Tyler lowered his head and followed his father out the door. The moment they were gone, Ethan let out a long breath. Ben grinned. We did it. Mr. Harris nodded. Your record is cleared, Ethan. And I apologize for believing the wrong people. Ethan exhaled slowly. Thank you. His grandfather squeezed his shoulder. Justice always finds a way. Ethan nodded. But deep down, he knew. Richard Jacobs wasn't finished with him yet. And the next time he struck, he wouldn't miss. Ethan wanted to believe it was over. He wanted to believe that after everything, the trial, the humiliation, the framing, he could finally breathe again. But something deep inside him knew better. Because Richard Jacobs didn't lose. Not without fighting back. And when he did, it wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be clean. It would be war. 2 days later, Ethan sat in his small apartment, flipping through his textbook, trying to focus on his homework. His grandfather sat across the table, sipping his tea, watching him with quiet pride. It was peaceful, too peaceful. Then, bang, bang, bang. A loud knock rattled the door. Ethan and his grandfather exchanged a look. James Carter stood slowly, his expression darkening. Stay here. Ethan's stomach twisted as his grandfather walked to the door. The moment it opened, his blood ran cold. Standing there were 2 police officers. And behind them, Richard Jacobs. Ethan shot to his feet. What's going on? The taller officer pulled out a paper. Ethan Carter, you're under investigation for theft. Ethan felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. What? Richard smirked, his arms crossed. Such a shame. I tried to warn you, boy. James' face hardened. This is ridiculous. Theft of what? The shorter officer cleared his throat. A large sum of money was stolen from the school's donation fund last night. The security system was disabled, and an anonymous tip pointed to Ethan Carter. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. You're lying. Richard chuckled. Now, let's not get emotional. James stepped forward. This is a setup. His voice was cold, controlled. Like last time. The taller officer sighed. Look, sir, we're just following orders. We need Ethan to come with us for questioning. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. Richard's smirk widened. He planned this. And this time, Ethan might not escape. 30 minutes later, Ethan sat in another interrogation room. His fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his skin. Across from him sat the same officer from last time. Detective Owens. Owens exhaled, folding his hands. Ethan, we're giving you a chance to explain yourself. Ethan glared. I didn't do it. Owen studied him for a long moment. Then why does the security footage show someone matching your description entering the school after hours? Ethan's breath caught. What? Owen slid a file across the table. See for yourself. Ethan hesitated, then flipped it open. The grainy security footage showed a hooded figure sneaking through the school halls. Same height as Ethan. Same build as Ethan. It looked like him, but it wasn't. Ethan felt his stomach drop. That's not me. Owen sighed. Do you have an alibi? Ethan clenched his jaw. I was home. With my grandfather. Owens nodded slowly. Anyone else see you? Ethan hesitated. His grandfather was his only witness, and he already knew what the police would say. Family doesn't count as an alibi. Owen sat back. Look, kid, if you're being framed, you need proof. Otherwise, this doesn't look good for you. Ethan swallowed hard. He needed help. Fast. Back at home, Ethan paced the living room while his grandfather sat deep in thought. They aren't arresting you yet, his grandfather said. But if we don't prove the truth soon, they will. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. They faked security footage. They had to. But how? His grandfather's eyes narrowed. They have money and power. That's how. Ethan clenched his jaw. Then we need to beat them at their own game. His grandfather studied him. What do you have in mind? Ethan exhaled. I need to find out who made that fake footage. There was only one person who could help with that. Ethan and Ben arrived at the library 20 minutes later. Milo Parker was already there, sipping an energy drink and typing furiously on his laptop. He barely looked up. You're lucky I like you, Carter. You owe me snacks for this. Ethan sat down. Milo, I need to prove the security footage is fake. Milo smirked. Say no more. Ben leaned in. Wait, you know how to do that? Milo scoffed. Do birds fly? He cracked his knuckles. Deepfake technology is powerful, but it leaves traces. I just need access to the raw security footage. Ethan's stomach dropped. The real footage is at the police station. Milo sighed. Then we have a problem. Ben suddenly snapped his fingers. What about the backup files? Ethan frowned. What backup files? Ben grinned. The school automatically backs up its security footage every night to an external drive in the IT office. Milo's eyes widened. That might actually work. Ethan's pulse quickened. Then we have to get that footage. Ben shifted uncomfortably. Please tell me we're not breaking into another office. Milo shrugged. Hey, at least it's not the security room this time. Ethan took a deep breath. Then let's do it. Because this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting to bring Richard Jacobs down. Later that night, Ethan, Ben, and Milo crouched outside the IT office. The school was dark, the halls eerily silent. Milo peered at the door's keypad lock. Easy. I've seen the IT guy punch in his code before. Ben groaned. Why does that not surprise me? Milo quickly typed in the numbers, and the door clicked open. Ethan held his breath. Let's move. They slipped inside. Rows of computers lined the walls, blinking softly in the dark. Milo rushed to a desk and booted up a computer. All right. If I were a paranoid IT guy, where would I keep my backups? Ben pointed to a locked filing cabinet in the corner. There. Ethan nodded. We need a key. Milo grinned. Who needs keys when you have this? He pulled out a hairpin. Ben sighed. I don't even want to know why you have that. Milo picked the lock in seconds. The drawer slid open, and inside, tucked between files, was a hard drive labeled Security Backup. Ethan grabbed it. Milo plugged it into the computer and started working his magic. Minutes later, he let out a whistle. Oh yeah, this footage? Definitely faked. Ethan's breath caught. Can you prove it? Milo grinned. Not only can I prove it, I can trace it. His fingers flew over the keyboard. Then, he froze. Ethan's stomach tightened. What is it? Milo's eyes widened. The deepfake was created on a private system. He turned, his voice barely above a whisper. And guess who owns that system? Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. Milo exhaled sharply. Richard Jacobs. Ethan's fists clenched. They finally had him. Ethan's heart pounded. They had proof. Real, undeniable proof that Richard Jacobs had faked the security footage. Milo turned the laptop screen toward them, the blue glow casting eerie shadows across his face. The deepfake was created using software registered to Jacobs Enterprises. The timestamp? The night before the theft happened. He smirked. That's game over. Ben let out a slow breath. We actually got him. Ethan clenched his fists. Not yet. He glanced toward the door. We need to get this to the police before Jacobs finds out we have it. Milo quickly transferred the files onto a USB drive. Here. This is our golden ticket. Ethan grabbed it and shoved it into his pocket. Let's go. But just as they turned to leave, a sound. Footsteps. Getting closer. Ethan's stomach flipped. Someone's coming. Milo's fingers flew across the keyboard, shutting everything down. We need to hide. Ben darted behind a desk. Milo crouched under the table. Ethan barely had time to dive behind a filing cabinet before. The door swung open. A beam of light from a flashlight cut through the darkness. Ethan held his breath. A security guard stepped into the room, his heavy boots echoing in the silence. He scanned the room, his face unreadable. Ethan felt sweat bead on his forehead. If they got caught now. Then suddenly, the guard's radio crackled. Patrol complete? A voice asked. The guard sighed and pressed a button. Yeah, all clear. He turned and walked out, shutting the door behind him. Ethan exhaled slowly. Milo whispered, that was too close. Ben stood up, brushing dust from his hoodie. Let's never do this again. Ethan grinned. Deal. But first, we take this to the police. They slipped out of the IT room and into the night. Ethan knew they weren't safe yet, but for the first time, he felt something he hadn't in weeks. Hope. The next morning, Ethan and his grandfather walked into the police station, USB drive in hand. Detective Owens raised an eyebrow as they entered. Ethan, back so soon? Ethan took a deep breath. I can prove I didn't steal that money. Owens leaned forward. Go on. Ethan pulled the USB from his pocket and set it on the desk. That drive contains proof that the security footage was faked. Owens frowned but plugged it into his computer. As the video played, his expression darkened. The exact deepfake that had framed Ethan. The exact timestamp that proved it was created before the supposed crime even happened. And then, the final nail in the coffin. Milo's digital trace showing the deepfake software registered under Jacobs Enterprises. Owens leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. Well, I'll be damned. Ethan clenched his fists. Now do you believe me? Owens nodded slowly. This changes everything. Ethan's grandfather folded his arms. What happens now? Owens picked up the phone. Now? We bring in Richard Jacobs. 1 hour later, Ethan stood outside the police station as officers led Richard Jacobs inside. The once confident businessman looked rattled, his expensive suit slightly wrinkled, his jaw clenched in frustration. Tyler stood nearby, watching, his face pale. Ethan stepped forward. I told you I wasn't afraid of you. Richard scoffed. Enjoy your little victory, Carter. It won't last. Ethan smirked. We'll see about that. The officers pulled Richard inside. Ethan turned to Tyler. For the first time, the bully looked small, defeated. Ethan studied him. You don't have to be like him, Tyler. Tyler looked away. I don't know how to be anything else. Ethan exhaled. Then figure it out. Before it's too late. Tyler didn't answer. But for the first time, Ethan saw something in his eyes. Regret. The news spread fast. By the next day, everyone knew the truth. Ethan Carter wasn't a criminal. He was a hero. Richard Jacobs was officially under investigation for fraud and obstruction of justice. Tyler stopped coming to school. And Ethan? For the first time in a long time, he walked down the halls with his head held high. Ben grinned as they passed a group of students whispering excitedly. Dude, people are actually talking about you. Ethan laughed. For once, I don't mind. Milo joined them, holding up his phone. By the way, you owe me snacks for life. This whole thing was a lot of work. Ethan smirked. Deal. Ben nudged him. So, how does it feel to be the most talked about kid in school? Ethan exhaled. Weird. He grinned. But good. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he was free. Ethan sat on the front steps of his apartment building, watching the world move on around him. The past few weeks had been a storm of chaos: court trials, false accusations, breaking into the school's IT office, which he still couldn't believe they had pulled off, and finally, Richard Jacobs' downfall. Now, things were quiet. Almost too quiet. Ben plopped down beside him, balancing a bag of chips on his lap. "So," he said through a mouthful of food. "What now?" Ethan leaned back on his elbows, staring at the sky. "I don't know. I guess we just go back to normal." Ben snorted. "Normal? Dude, you exposed one of the most powerful guys in the city. You're practically famous." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, famous for almost going to jail." Ben waved a chip in the air. "Wrong. Famous for proving the truth when no one else would." Ethan smiled but didn't respond, because deep down, something still didn't feel finished. Richard Jacobs was under investigation, sure. The police had proof that he had faked the footage. But guys like Richard didn't just disappear. And Ethan had a feeling. This wasn't over. Later that evening, Ethan sat across from his grandfather at the dinner table, poking at his mashed potatoes. James Carter sipped his tea, watching him carefully. "You're thinking about Jacobs, aren't you?" Ethan sighed. "Yeah." His grandfather nodded. "Smart boy." Ethan frowned. "You think he's going to come back?" James set his cup down with a quiet clink. "Men like Richard Jacobs don't like losing. And when they do..." His gaze darkened. "They don't lose quietly." Ethan swallowed hard. "So what do we do?" His grandfather exhaled. "We stay prepared. And we don't let fear control us." Ethan nodded. But his gut told him fear wasn't the problem. The storm was coming, and he wasn't sure if he was ready. The next morning, Ethan walked into school expecting to feel relief. Instead, he felt the weight of 100 eyes on him. Again, students whispered as he passed. "That's the kid who took down Jacobs. I heard Jacobs is trying to get back at him. Do you think he's safe?" Ethan sighed. He had thought being falsely accused was bad, but being known was just as exhausting. Ben appeared at his side, arms crossed. "I hate how they're all whispering like you're some kind of legend." Milo walked up, adjusting his glasses. "He is a legend. I helped make him a legend, so technically, I'm a legend too." Ethan chuckled. "You just hacked a computer." Milo gasped. "Excuse me? That was art." Ben smirked. Yeah, whatever. Look, let's just get to class before someone asks Ethan for an autograph." They turned the corner and stopped, because standing there, leaning against the lockers like he had never left, was Tyler Jacobs. Ben stiffened. "Oh, no. Nope. Absolutely not." Milo took a step back. "This feels like the start of a bad sequel." Ethan tensed. Tyler hadn't been at school since his father's arrest. So why was he here? Tyler pushed off the lockers and walked toward them, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice so low only they could hear, he said, "You need to be careful." Ethan frowned. "What?" Tyler's jaw tightened. "My dad. He's not giving up. He's furious. He's trying to get out of this, and when he does," he swallowed, "he's coming for you." Ben crossed his arms. "Oh, now you care?" Tyler shot him a sharp look. "You don't get it. He doesn't care about me. He never did. But you?" His eyes met Ethan's. "You embarrassed him. You beat him." Ethan's stomach twisted. Tyler exhaled. I don't know why I'm telling you this." His voice dropped lower. "Maybe because I know what happens when he's angry." Ethan studied him. Tyler wasn't just warning him. He was scared. For the first time, Ethan saw the cracks in Tyler's usual arrogant mask. This wasn't about some petty schoolyard fight anymore. This was about Richard Jacobs. And Richard was still dangerous. Tyler shoved his hands in his pockets and muttered, "Just watch your back." Then he walked away, leaving them in stunned silence. Milo let out a low whistle. "Well, that's new." Ben rubbed his forehead. "I don't know what's worse, that Tyler actually warned us, or that I believe him." Ethan's jaw clenched. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And when Richard Jacobs made his next move, Ethan would be ready. Or at least, he hoped he would be. That night, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. He should have been finishing his homework. Instead, He was reading every article he could find about Richard Jacobs' case. The man had power, connections, money. Ethan had seen men like him before. They didn't lose. They waited. A cold chill crept down Ethan's spine. Was Richard planning something? And if he was, how far would he go? Ethan shut his laptop and exhaled. This wasn't over. But when it was, he would make sure Richard Jacobs never hurt anyone again. Ethan sat on the rooftop of his apartment building, staring at the glowing city below. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren. It had been weeks since Richard Jacobs was arrested. Weeks since Ethan had cleared his name. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something big. He wasn't wrong. Because at that very moment, his phone buzzed. A text from Ben. Ben, dude, turn on the news. Now, Ethan's stomach twisted. He rushed inside, flipped on the TV, and froze. Breaking news. Richard Jacobs released on bail. Ethan's blood ran cold. The screen showed footage of Jacobs stepping out of the courthouse, dressed in a sharp suit, flanked by his lawyers. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. Richard smiled. Smug. Unbothered. Untouchable. A microphone was shoved in his face. Mr. Jacobs, do you have a comment about your case? Richard smirked. Oh, I'm not worried. The truth always wins in the end. Ethan's fists clenched. Ben called. Ethan picked up immediately. Tell me this isn't happening, Ben said, his voice tight. Ethan swallowed. It's happening. Ben cursed under his breath. So what do we do? If he's out, he's gonna come after you. You know that. Ethan took a slow, deep breath. Then he said the words he had been thinking for weeks. We finished this. The next day, Ethan and his grandfather arrived at the police station. Detective Owens raised an eyebrow as they entered. I was expecting you. Ethan crossed his arms. Jacobs is out. What now? Owens sighed, rubbing his temples. His lawyers argued that the deepfake evidence wasn't directly tied to him. They're claiming someone else did it without his knowledge. Ethan gritted his teeth. That's a lie. Owens nodded. Of course it is. But he's slippery. He knows how to play the system. Ethan exhaled sharply. So, what do we do? Owens studied him for a moment. Then he leaned forward. We find the one thing he can't escape. Ethan frowned. And that is? Owens smirked. A confession. That night, Ethan sat in his room, staring at his phone. He had a plan. It was risky, but it was the only way. Ben's voice echoed in his head. If he's out, he's gonna come after you. Ethan knew that. And now? He was going to let him. Ethan opened his messages and typed. Ethan, let's talk. Face to face. He hit send. Minutes later, the reply came. Unknown number. Brave. Stupid, but brave. Ethan smirked. Ethan, tomorrow, 10 p.m. You know where. The response was instant. Unknown number. I'll be there. Ethan shut his phone. This was it. The final move. And when it was over, Richard Jacobs would never hurt anyone again. The next night, Ethan stood in the abandoned parking lot behind an old warehouse. The air was thick with tension. A sleek black car pulled up. Ethan's heart pounded. The door opened, and Richard Jacobs stepped out. He smiled. Brave kid. Ethan didn't move. I'm not afraid of you. Richard chuckled. You should be. Ethan exhaled. We both know why we're here. You want revenge. Richard's smile widened. Clever. Ethan took a step forward. But here's the thing. You lost. You faked evidence. You tried to frame me. And you failed. Richard's jaw tightened. Ethan met his gaze, unblinking. And the worst part? Everyone knows. Richard exhaled slowly. So? That doesn't mean I can't fix things. Ethan tilted his head. By what? Hurting me? Framing me again? Richard smirked. It worked before. Ethan grinned. Not this time. Richard frowned. Ethan pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward him. A live recording. Streaming. Richard's face, his voice, broadcasted everywhere. The police. The media. The world. Richard froze. Ethan's smile didn't waver. Checkmate. For the first time, Richard staggered. His usual confidence cracked. Then, Sirens. Flashing red and blue lights. Police cars swarmed the parking lot. Officers rushed forward. Richard took a step back. You. Ethan smiled. You lose. Detective Owens grabbed Richard's arms. Richard Jacobs, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and attempted intimidation of a witness. Richard struggled. This isn't over. Ethan crossed his arms. Yeah, it is. The officers shoved Richard into the back of a police car. And just like that, it was over. 1 week later, Ethan sat on the rooftop again, watching the sun rise. This time, he felt free. Ben plopped down beside him, grinning. Dude, you trapped Richard Jacobs. Milo appeared, munching on an energy bar. It was beautiful. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, it was. His grandfather's voice echoed in his head. The right thing is always worth doing, no matter what. Ethan exhaled. For the first time in a long time, he had one. And the best part? He had done it the right way. Ben elbowed him. So, what's next? Ethan smirked. Something normal. For once. They laughed, the weight of the past finally lifting. And as the sun climbed higher, Ethan knew, no matter what happened next, he would always fight for the truth. And that made him unstoppable.